is the tip of an iceberg. And just to be frank and to take an assessment of the forest perhaps rather than the trees, this is part of a pattern and practice of the American government under this administration, silencing its critics, selective prosecution, selective surveillance, and one of the most disturbing elements of this progression is that it's no longer selective. It's gone from being selective to becoming systematic. In the immediate wake of 9/11, the now nominee for Attorney General, Judge Michael Mukasey of the U.S. District Court in the Southern District of New York, signed off on hundreds of material witness detentions that allowed...
Yeah, Mukasey, is that the one currently up for Attorney General who can't decide whether waterboarding is torture or not?
That's even he's done things worse than that in the past. So as the Attorney General of the United States, he'd be the chief prosecutor, and he hasn't been able to commit publicly to declaring that the practice of simulated drowning is torture. That's a problem. Worse than that is that as a judge, already 6 years ago, he approved the detention of hundreds of Muslims without rights to counsel, to hearings, to challenge their accusers, supposedly as witnesses to other people's terrorist acts. Most of these people were never charged with anything, nor did they ever testify in any trials against anyone. That was the beginning of a long road. We've seen since then torture against people like Mr. Harar, whom David mentioned. We've seen and not only in the places we know about, like Guantanamo, but there are sites that remain secret to this day that the CIA maintained in Eastern Europe.
Which is where the one gentleman was transported to, basically secret prison. Well, we went out to the street and just kind of asked people on the street what they thought about this practice of putting activists, so on and so forth, on these lists. And if we could go ahead and go to the tape.
I don't think that people should be put on watch lists just because they're protesting the government, so no.
I do not think that it's fair because people oppose of the actual war, that they shouldn't be allowed to do certain things. That's just insane. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, and that does not make a person a terrorist just because they don't believe in something that the government does.
Yeah, people should not be put on watch lists just because they oppose the government. No, I think it's very wrong.
My opinion is that I think people should be allowed and to be free to do whatever they choose to do, and that they should not be put on any FBI list because they oppose what someone else thinks.
If people aren't engaged in any kind of illegal activities, you have the right to speak your mind against the government, whether you agree with it or not. That shouldn't prohibit you from leaving the country or entering any other country.
So, I mean, we pretty much were going around and could not find anybody that could justify. And in fairness, we did contact the FBI. We contacted the Canadian Embassy and invited them to be on the show tonight. And the ACLU, which at this point did not respond or declined to be on the show.
May I take a sort of counterpoint
Absolutely.
view just as a devil's advocate?
Absolutely.
I think the problem in Medea's case and Colonel Wright's case is what the Canadians did on the other side. I'm not convinced that there's a problem here on this side because we don't know if there's discrimination going into who's put on these lists. If it's simply on the ground that they have been convicted of offenses and they haven't been singled out because they've engaged in political activities, that's difficult for me to object to. But when the Canadian authorities on the other side select people to interrogate and investigate and harass because of their political views, that's where I find it problematic. I mean, they could have kept Martin Luther King out of Canada based on his civil disobedience, but the way that the question was put to the person in the street almost invited the answer that you received, because nobody believes in putting people on watch lists for their political beliefs, but that's not what happened here. What happened here is they were put on watch lists because, like many other people, they had convictions.
But I mean, is that no?
Convictions themselves stem from First Amendment activity, right? I mean, if we think about the history of domestic dissent and political dissent in a country that purports to be a democracy and lead the free world, our nation was founded from visible acts of prolific dissent. From that emerges a certain set of doctrine, legal doctrine, that allows the evisceration of the First Amendment insofar as one can be prosecuted for acts that are facially criminal. So Medea has misdemeanor convictions that themselves stem from political protest, included in a database at the discretion of authorities here. Now, you're right that we don't know necessarily why. And so for that reason, I agree with you that we can't make an airtight case that there's been a discrimination on the basis of Medea's views. But when we're talking about a government that has displayed so many reasons not to trust it, with respect to the reasons to invade other countries, with respect to the scope of its surveillance activities domestically, you raised Martin Luther King, who was surveilled by this government, led by the same people who are in office now, the last time a president did these things, and in that case was impeached.
Now, Medea, you said they had three convictions. What were those three convictions? I mean, were they felonies? Did you rob a bank? I mean, what are those three convictions that they had on the record?
One was holding hands with 25 women and standing in front of the White House, that's all. Standing in front of the White House, which today, post 9/11, is an arrestable offense. And we were arrested for trespassing, and we were charged with a $50 fine. Then I was arrested once in Congress when I got up when the Prime Minister of Iraq was here visiting, and I said the Iraqi people want the U.S. troops to leave, bring the troops home now. Also, there was a conviction for disruption of Congress, and it was a fine. And then the third one they had was when I tried to hand in petitions signed by 152,000 women from all over the world, a petition saying women say no to war, to then Ambassador John Bolton at the UN. They, instead of being a diplomat and saying, thank you for the petitions, you have a nice day, instead locked down the building and had us arrested, and I was convicted for trespassing, also a fine, in that case $75 fines. These are the kinds of convictions that are basically
cite and release.
Cite and release, like traffic violations, the amount.
These are for expressions of your political views.
These are for expressions of belief.
Well, I'm trying to get through what David had said about, possibly, everybody's being included on this list.
This should not be on this list. David, if you could just pass me that for a second. And there's a better explanation than the short one here. But there are categories that are for this National Crime Information Center database. And they are things like sex offenders, missing persons, unidentified persons, and members of violent gangs and terrorist organizations. I do not fit in any of these categories, and the crimes I was convicted for do not fit in any of these categories. So I disagree with you, David. I think it's terrible what the Canadians did, and they should know better, and they should not be using an FBI database to decide who goes into their country. But the crimes that I'm convicted for, and minor misdemeanors of any type, should not be included in that database.
Kate?
See, I think that Medea does raise the questions. In some ways, I think you choose to be engaged in acts of civil disobedience with the expectation that you are going to be arrested. And there is, of course, a long history, beginning with Thoreau, that you're going to be arrested for engaging in acts of civil disobedience. So that the fact that the government arrested you, but then the consequence of that is that they do put your name in a database, and we do have to assume that the U.S. government shared the database with the Canadian government, probably with the expectation that the Canadian government would then use it to deny people entry into Canada. And there is, I think, increasingly across borders an effort to deny people the right to travel based on their politics or based on what they're going to say when they get here. And in fact, Medea's organization has a long history of involvement in this issue because she challenged the ban on travel to Cuba by Americans. And it seems to me very suspicious that the United States government would share the database with the Canadians without at least saying, listen, the only thing you should do when you look at this is look for the names of sex offenders or serious escaped felons.
Now, do we know how people are getting put on this list?
Well, there are categories. There are public categories about...
Right, which were just stated, right?
That's right. And it is true that both the state and local police authorities and the FBI has the authority to enter names into the database. There's been concern for many years about the accuracy of the database, about how people's names get entered, and there's very little oversight or procedures about doing that. But then the question is how there's a little transparency about that, more than with the terrorist watch list. But what there isn't, there's no longer any agreement on who it makes sense to put in